Okay. Are we paused? We're not broadcasting live over YouTube now, Ross. Is that right? Sure. Sure. Okay.
Okay, are you going to pop your hand down?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Right, we've done minutes. Disclosures of members' interest. Is there anyone interested? I take that to be a no. I can't see any hands go up. Over to you, Phil. Report from the Head of Housing and Protection. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And as Ian says, it's been a few months, I think, since we've been together. So a couple of observations and comments from myself, I suppose, on that. I think, first of all, an apology, because we probably are overdue a meeting of both licensing and licensing regulatory. But as you'll all appreciate, within the early months of the pandemic, many of our services, many of our committee functions were thrown into a slight degree of disruption. Obviously, we have had those meetings back online again, but it's really taken us a little bit of time I think, to get licensing and regulatory back up and running. So what I'm basically trying to do today, and I've discussed this both with Ian as the chair and with Ken as the vice chair, is really start off today a discussion with yourselves across both committees about how we develop a forward plan for the committees. So for that, I actually need your input as members of the committee. So in part today, what we're going to try and do is, I suppose, tidy up some loose ends, but also deal with some additional papers, which hopefully will create discussion with yourselves. So without further ado, I'm going to go into the first report, which is very much around further committee reports. So in the context of what I've just said, myself, officers have obviously been looking at the work that the committee has previously been involved with, and I suppose previous areas of interest as well. Some of these, I must admit, date back to when I held the single role of Head of Public Protection, so that's pre-2016. So what I'm really asking from yourselves, I'm going to talk through them individually, are your views and comments about whether or not we take these forward with a view to informing, as I say, a forward plan for the committee. But equally from yourselves, any other suggestions or ideas or areas of interest that you may have as a committee where you think you require further information to be brought to you to either enable you to have a better understanding of the topic, enable you to, I suppose, make more informed judgments or more informed decision making. So as much of what I'm about to say is, you know, from an officer perspective, but it needs an equal contribution from yourselves as members of the committee. So within this report, we have set out a number of areas where we think there are some opportunities. First one is about review of all the locally set licence fees. And I say I need to differentiate here because some of the fees that we work to, more so within the licensing committee, are actually set by national government, so we have no ability to interfere with those whatsoever. But many of the licence fees within licensing and regulatory are very much locally determined, and it is, as I said, good practice for us to review those from time to time. Clearly, one of the factors at the moment is the impact of COVID, the impact upon businesses, and just generally income within those businesses. So you may decide that actually, yes, you want to review it, but importantly, just because you review something doesn't mean you're going to change it. It may well be to agree. I'm getting a bit of echo. It may well just be to agree that we are happy with the current licence fees. So don't feel that because you review something, you have to change it. It is good practice to review, even if it is just to confirm the status quo. We've identified the area of consideration, removal or amendment of the Hackney carriage zones. I'm looking at the chair to see if you've got echo. Have you, Ian?
I tapped my mouse there by mistake, sorry. I meant to stay muted.
I'm just asking Ian in capacity of chair, have you got echo on the system? It's gone again, sorry.
No.
So in terms of the removal of Hackney carriage zones, you will recall, for those who've been on the committee previously, that we still operate 6 Hackney carriage licensing zones, and they reflect the former district councils of Northumberland. There was a period of time when the traffic commissioners were looking at a review of many areas across Hackney carriage private hire licensing, and there was a thought at that point that they may give the local authority some discretion to have a different number of zones, because legally speaking we can either have 6 or we can have 1. But there was a point at which it was suggested we may be able to reduce that to 2, where we possibly have an urban and a rural. That never came to fruition, so we are still left with the same options of 6 or 1, and it may be something that you wish to look at in the future, or quite happily just retain the status quo. We've talked before about amendment of policy in relation to CCTV in licensed vehicles. And you could wrap that up, I suppose, with a general review of our Hackney carriage and private hire licensing policy, you know, to ensure that it remains fit for purpose. Hackney carriage tariffs we've dealt with on numerous occasions across this committee in previous years. And again, it is good practice for us to review that. We ultimately set the tariff as a maximum tariff, and it is then a matter for the actual trade to determine whether or not they wish to operate at that maximum, but they are at liberty to charge a lesser amount should they wish to do so. Probably the last significant piece of work we did around this was trying to rationalise and have consistency across the 6 zones, because we are still carrying forward some inconsistencies from the 6 zones. So the last really substantive piece of work was trying to create single tariffs and single approach. But again, it may be something that you want to revisit, or it may be a case of think, well, actually, because of COVID, we don't want to put any additional pressure on the trade. The trade may have, however, have the view that actually they are struggling and they would like the opportunity to actually generate additional income. The final one that we've put forward is a review of our street trading policy. Obviously, all forms of trading have been severely impacted by COVID, but we do have a street trading policy, and as you're aware, that governs what activities can be undertaken as street trading, and it sets out the framework that we have put in place in Northumberland County Council to receive applications and determine whether or not they actually grant consent for people to trade, whether that be in localised areas or generally across Northumberland. But it is a means for us as a county council to control some of that activity, but also, I suppose, create opportunities for businesses who wish to trade in that manner rather than from fixed premises. And clearly for some businesses, you know, through the COVID pandemic, many businesses have benefited from that and actually using street trading as a takeaway service, you know, because many premises haven't been open to the public, haven't allowed customers on site, but street trading vendors with food have still had the ability to trade, and that has actually worked quite well for them. So I suppose from my perspective, Chair, it is really to open it up for discussion with the committee as to whether or not there are any of those areas they want to pursue. But, and I'll stress this again, are there any other areas they as a committee want to explore further as part of the sort of work programme for the committee going forward? Thank you, and I will mute myself.
I'll come back on then. Has anybody got any comments? If so, would you like to raise a hand? Councillor Seymour.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just have a couple of questions here. On the consideration of removal or amendment of the Hackney carriage zones that we have 6 for, and we can either only have 6 or 1. You mentioned we could have 2, sort of rural or urban. I'm just wondering what the benefit would be. So that's the one question, you know, to change that. I think it's a good idea to review locally set licence fees. We don't need to change anything, but we can review it. That's a good idea. And the other thing, the review of Hackney carriage tariffs, which we changed, they're all at par now, aren't they? I'm just wondering, because we changed that a couple of years ago, was it? I'm just wondering how that's working, that's all. And the other thing is, sorry, I've forgot a couple of other things. Regarding the COVID-19 regulations, for standards for carriages, should we have, I know it probably would mean extra costs, but some sort of separation. I don't know if some of them do already, but you know, like the black cabs in London, you know, they have the glass. I'm just wondering if that is something that perhaps could be put in as well. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Phil, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Seymour. So if I take those in order, if I've caused some confusion, apologies. So the current legal position is, yes, we can either have 6 Hackney carriage zones or 1. The suggestion of 2 was something that was mooted about 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it's probably something we would have pursued, but that isn't able to, that we're not able to do that as a legal option. So it is that stark contrast of do we have 6 or 1. In terms of the benefits, and I suppose equally the disbenefits, there are probably a number. There will be part of the trade who will say that by having one zone, it then allows them greater flexibility to trade. It also remains in terms of the customer. It removes some of that uncertainty about, can I hail this carriage in the street? Can I stop this carriage in the street? Because technically speaking, when you're operating as a Hackney carriage, you can only do so in the true sense within the confines of the original district council boundary. So that does lead to some confusion for the individuals and for the public. But I suppose if you flip that on its head, there will be other parts of the trade will say, actually, we don't want that situation where you will have taxi drivers from one locality coming into another and stealing our custom or taking our trade away from us. One of the common expressions used, I suppose, is whether or not there is a honeypot in Northumberland which would then automatically draw all of the trade to that one area. So I do know when Durham removed their zones and moved to a single zone for Durham County Council, they saw a lot of taxis moving from some of the smaller districts as they were into Durham itself, into Durham city centre, because they thought there was more trade there. So I think there are probably benefits and disbenefits to whether or not you retain one or you have 6. I think my officers would say there are some benefits to us as a licensing authority, because of how we then deal with the trade is quite consistent and uniform, even down to the basic level of, you know, we would have a standard plate. We wouldn't then be citing it as one, you know, Blythe Valley zone or Tynedale zone or something like that. So there are some, I suppose, fairly simple and pragmatic benefits to us as a licensing authority. But clearly, I think the question here is whether it is a benefit to the trade and or the users of that system. And I think you will find with that, Councillor Seymour, there will be conflicting arguments and conflicting views on that. And there may be an argument to say, well, if it isn't broke, don't fix it and just leave it as 6 at the moment. In terms of locally set fees, yes, absolutely, we can review those and bring them forward to you. Fundamentally, the licensing service is supposed to be designed on a cost recovery basis. It is not intended to generate a profit. So we do, as a matter of course, have to review our fees so that we can defend any challenge from the trade or other sectors to say, well, actually, all you're doing here is you're charging excessive fees to generate income. So it's good practice to do that from an audit perspective. In terms of the tariffs, I've got to be honest with you, Councillor Seymour, I'm not close enough to it, and Tasman Hardy may have a view about whether or not we've had any significant issues with the tariffs. I'm not aware of any where we've had significant problems. And I think the key thing to remember is the way in which we set the tariff, it is set as a maximum. So there's always the ability for an individual operator to actually charge a lesser amount. And we do have examples where you will have a company who have provided services to a number of people for a number of years, and they will continually charge them a lesser amount, and that's completely lawful. But equally, when they're working in the nighttime economy, they will charge the maximum tariff. So they will flex in and out. And I suppose the only challenge you get from that is probably when you have, again, other companies challenging why people aren't charging the same amount, and it's unfair competition, but it is well within their gift to charge the lesser amount. In terms of COVID and standards that you referred to, there has been a significant amount of work done with the trade during the pandemic. So whilst we haven't met as a committee, we have been working actively with all aspects of the trade. And so when it comes to taxis, again, there's been a significant amount of central government guidance on public transport, personal protection measures, etc., etc. We haven't taken that forward as a requirement to create separation. And in part, I think that's because when you look at the fleet, it would actually be very complex and probably very expensive for some of the vehicles to be adapted to create that degree of separation, especially if you're trying to separate the front seat passenger from the driver, as well as the driver from the back seat passengers. Black cabs, you know, because people will be familiar with black cabs, lend themselves much easier to that. But having said that, we have seen some of our proprietors actually doing that as a matter of choice and actually installing screens. So the trade has done that. The trade has also acted upon general advice. But I think from our point of view, we have very much left it to the trade. We've left it to the national guidance, because I think one of the challenges we face is, and it's not a reason not to do it, it's just a complexity of doing it. When you start to set up very prescriptive standards about physical separation, you are introducing a hazard into the vehicle, because obviously the last thing you want is for that screen to become detached, or for there to be an accident and somebody to strike that screen. So I'm not shying away from it as, you know, as a measure, but I think to do it, and to do it sort of swiftly or quickly, has created challenges for us. So it's very much about working with the trade and trying to get them to develop best practice and follow government guidelines. Hopefully that addresses, I think, the questions you asked, Councillor Seymour.
Yes, just on that last point, you know, perhaps the taxis that are in operation now will be, if you like, grandfathered, but anything going forward, perhaps there would need to be, you know, some standards and requirements. I mean, if this is going to stick around for a long time, it might be something that we have to do. So that's just my point, but thank you very much for that.
Tasman, you had your hand up there for a while. Did you want to say something?
It was just in relation to Phil's comment about the Hackney carriage tariffs. Just to say we have had a request for a review of the tariff in relation to the larger vehicles, in relation to the last tariff, tariff 3.
Thank you. Looking at the board, I've got Councillor Roughead first.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for this report. And if we're talking about the forward plan of the committee, perhaps it might have been pertinent to have some form of workshop session prior to this meeting, so we had a bit of a plan to agree to at the end of this meeting moving forward. But in terms of a review of locally set licence fees, presumably that's includes, you know, when a taxi driver, the fees they paid, you know, like the 1 year or 3 year. So my question is, within COVID, why was I was led to believe by speaking to people in the trade who approached me that the 3 year licence, you know, for being able to get a 3 year licence was suspended last year because of COVID, and they could only get a 1 year one. So because if that's true, people have been penalised on that. Is there a way in which people who would have normally perhaps have got a 3 year licence but could only get a 1 year one, that there's some form of reduction cost moving forward? Because as we all know, the taxi trade is one of the many sectors that's taken a massive impact throughout COVID, and there's been mass inconsistencies around the country in terms of what local authorities have done to support our taxi trade, and sadly within Northumberland we haven't been as good as an authority in supporting them as what other ones are. And just from a regional perspective on the Joint Transport Committee, we appreciate and acknowledge that obviously licensing is a matter for each of the constituent authorities, but there is an acknowledgement that taxi, private hire and coaches do form part of the strategic transport network. So as part of our response to Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee into the impact COVID's had upon local transport, we have raised concerns about the lack of national consistency in terms of the taxi and coach sector, and that if there is more funding made available for those sectors, that would be managed nationally so there's a consistency. Because I think one local authority ended up giving like £500 regardless to whether they were eligible for other schemes or not, and then other ones have given different amounts. So where it's a point to share the information wider, I'll share the correspondence with the officers and members of this committee just as a wider information point. But my main question is, can we have a look at the licence fees? And if possible, I would say, can it be us as a council that takes the hit, not the actual taxi drivers themselves? Because to us sat around the table, that might not be a lot of money, but for some people where this is their only form of income and they're not being able to operate this year because of COVID, but they want to continue re-registering so they can do some form of provision of the service. It is quite a bit, especially if they haven't been eligible for any, the furlough schemes, if they're sort of a sole practitioner equivalent of that, or they haven't been eligible for other things, or they're not eligible to support from like DWP. I think we should do a thorough review of the fees and possibly look at, whilst we're in the pandemic, lowering it, and maybe as an authority create some real discretionary grant of where if there is demonstrated hardship, and obviously officers will know what criteria might be needed by legislation, that we maybe waiver the fee for existing taxi drivers. And the other points I've got is on the other report. Thanks.
My first reaction to that is we're not a charity, though. As a council, we can't be a charity. We can't lose money. We're looking for breaking even. Tasman, you had your hand up there. Did you want to reply to that, or Phil?
I think if Tasman, could I ask Tasman to pick up the first point you raised, Councillor Roughead, in terms of the 1 or 3 year licence, then I'll come in with a couple of observations after that, if that's acceptable.
Yeah, in relation to the 1 or 3 year licence, in order to get a system up and running to allow online applications, we did say to applicants, if you pay for your 1 year licence now, we'll process your application, but if you want to have a 3 year licence, you can pay the extra at a later date and we will issue you with a 3 year licence. The 1 year was to enable us to basically continue to process applications in a timely manner. So we didn't bar them from a 3 year licence at all.
So if I come in, Councillor Hutchinson?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's important. I mean, as I said at the outset, if we go back to the 23rd of March last year, when the Prime Minister announced we were going into a national lockdown, you will all remember that, many of the council services were just stood down overnight. And it did take us a little while to either stand those services back up or re-provide those services in a different way. And as Tasman has described, where we previously had a lot of face-to-face contact with the trade in terms of the application process, that was taken away from us. It was very much about moving to an online system. And I suppose if you look at COVID, there are certain aspects of COVID or certain aspects of service delivery we will continue beyond COVID because it has made us more accessible. But in terms of that specific question, Councillor Roughead, it was an interim position. But I think the important thing was that was about enabling us to keep business open and allow people to continue to trade. But the caveat was always there that we could revisit that with them and would revisit that with them to extend what was a 1 year licence into a 3 year licence. Because again, one of the reasons we did that several years ago was about recognising that we were repeating the process, every year. There was potentially benefits in us doing it on a 3 year basis, whilst we still kept the same safeguards in terms of DBS, etc., etc. So I think for us it's worked quite well, the 3 year, and it's probably worked quite well for the trade, subject to them signing up for the online DBS arrangements. But just to stress, where we have had to amend some service delivery, but where possible we have expanded that now, and we've maintained the ability to receive, process and grant licences. I think in terms of the decisions of the council, etc., I'm not going to comment any further. Obviously, Councillor Hutchinson has dealt with that in terms of, what the council may or may wish to do. Whether or not that's a matter the committee wants to take forward and make a recommendation to the council for, that is not a matter for me. But obviously, it may be something you wish to discuss. I think the other thing just to comment upon Councillor Roughead, and I'm not sure if this is what you meant in terms of consistency. Oh, sorry, one of the aspects of consistency. One of the great frustrations, I think, within local government and within licensing is the lack of consistency. Because if we adopt an approach in Northumberland, which we believe to be sensible, pragmatic, etc., etc., no matter what the rationale for that is, if there is another local authority doing something different, the question will always be posed to us, why aren't we doing it the same as this authority in a different part of the country, and vice versa? And one of the real hopes when we go back to the Law Commission review, which was 2014, 15, which was where there was a suggestion about, more flexibility around the zones, etc. I think a lot of licensing authorities at that time hoped that government would create some degree of national standards and consistency for licensing authorities around vehicles and drivers. I've always set out before this committee, my view is that the legislation provides us with a framework and a structure. We've got to do the detail. And unfortunately, it's the detail which always gets unpicked because we're not consistent. And I think there was an opportunity missed with the Law Commission review not to introduce some degree of commonality across all local authorities. But that, again, that's out with our gift at the moment.
Thank you. Is that okay, Gregor?
Well, just thanks for that. I appreciate the response from the officers, but just to say that as a final comment, that I think the council had some form of £500 grant made available to taxi drivers, but a lot of them that I'm aware of who've been in contact with me weren't eligible for that because, again, it set like restrictions on. And can I ask that be, or this committee or the officers from this committee take that up and speak to the officers in the relevant department to try and make sure that it's not like a false grant in the sense that you expect somebody to go through all this paperwork and then by the end of it there's in reality no chance of them getting it because it's a form of social cruelty that. And then working with a cabinet member ahead of Christmas, there was I made him cabinet member for the finance. I made him aware of this issue, and they did create like if people weren't eligible for that, a discretionary thing for £200. But come on, that's not exactly enough. And I would just say that all this needs to be looked at more thoroughly, and obviously needs to be considered elsewhere. And I would just hope that as a committee, we would ask the relevant decision makers to at least keep a watch and brief on this, and at least come back with a satisfactory answer. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Gregor. I'm sure that will be taken on board. We did have Councillor Sesford did have his hand up. Do you still wish to say something, Councillor Sesford?
Well, some of the points I'm going to put already, so I'll just leave it for the moment.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Patterson.
I won't labour the point, Ian, because I realise we're overrunning. I just really wanted to ask Phil, does Durham still have a one-zone policy?
Yes, in terms of, to the best of my knowledge, Councillor Patterson, yes, they still operate with a single zone. There is a formal process you must go through to merge from whatever their number was. I think it was 7 into 1. But yes, they still operate with a single zone. But I do know in the early days, I think they were having to create overflow car parking in other towns rather than having all of the taxis in Durham Centre at the time. And undoubtedly, when you create that honeypot, it will have an attraction, probably, a higher attraction for a number of months, and that probably wanes or drops off. But they still do operate a single zone. Yeah.
I think it would probably be a very good idea. And certainly I can never get a taxi in Alnwick. I know there's loads in Berwick and I know there's loads in Morpeth. I can't speak for Hexham, but I do know Alnwick. I always seem to struggle to get one. So I just would welcome it, I feel. And just in regard to licence fees, I don't think we should raise them at the moment, certainly, but we are coming out into the light. So maybe in 6 months' time we could look at that. Just my opinion.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll carry on to the next one, vehicle emissions, Phil.
So I suppose, sorry, Chair, just before we move on, I think just really to try and get some form of work programme here. What I would like, I suppose, as the head of service is to understand what the committee is asking me to do. So from what I've heard is there is a suggestion to actually look at, even if we just simply review them, some of our locally set fees, so we can bring a paper back on the fees at the next committee or a committee in advance. as Tasman has identified, there is a specific request coming from the trade around tariffs, and specifically for the larger vehicles. So we look to bring that as a report forward as well. And what we can do outside of the meeting, if that's acceptable to the committee, is with yourself, Chair, and with the Vice Chair, agree some sort of order to bring these back. So it's locally set fees. There's an ask, I think, around review of the tariffs themselves to bring that back. And I think the other one which has been, well, I suppose the other one which has just been mentioned there by Councillor Patterson is we can bring back for information, if it benefits the members, I suppose just a report which sets out the current zones and I suppose the numbers of Hackney carriages we've got within each of those zones. So you're cited on the supply. In essence, again, there is no, sorry, the mechanism by which you would seek to control the numbers of Hackney carriages you would have in any one area is subject to what's referred to as unmet need. So if you like, you can license as many taxis as you wish, so long as you're not over licensing and you're not under licensing. So there should be enough taxis within a community so that there is no unmet need. So what we can do is bring a report back which gives you an idea of the numbers in each. We can't really comment upon the unmet need because you've got to do a specific survey for that. I think the other thing we've got a challenge with is actually understanding how some of our trade work. So the old idea of a Hackney carriage which is hailed in the street can still take place, but most operate from ranks, etc., etc. But I think what we'll do for the committee, if it's okay, Chair, is we'll bring you back a report just giving you a bit more information on the zones themselves, the numbers of vehicles licensed in each zone, and potentially also, what, if we can, what we've got in the way of actual taxi ranks within those localities as well, just again for information for the committee. So there's at least 3 areas of work we can bring back to you.
Thanks, Phil. Personally, I'd like to see, as you've got on your list here, amendment of policy in relation to CCTV in licensed vehicles. I think that should, in a way, become compulsory to all licensed Hackney carriages and private hire, just for safety for both sides, safety for the person they're carrying and safety for the actual driver. We have had cases where the driver's been accused of sexual assaults, that sort of thing. And, you know, I think it would cover those sort of events. Having said that, could we move on to vehicle emissions, please? Yeah.
In terms of vehicle emissions, I'll keep this brief. It's probably easier for hand across to Tasman Hardy. This is really just sort of trying to give the committee a position on where we're at now. So if Tasman would like to just explain the position just for information.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, members will be aware that we previously brought reports to committee regarding the possibility of introducing a amended vehicle emissions policy. Obviously, we were meant to go out to further consultation just before the first lockdown, which created a few issues in relation to our communication with the trade and their ability to respond effectively to such a big consultation in relation to a big effect upon their requirements in relation to the emissions policy. Members will note, it's stated in point 6 of the report, that some of the dates within the recommendations are extremely close. You're talking about, the proposal was a 4-year vehicle age policy would come into effect from April 2020. Obviously, that date is far too close to bring that in now. We were hoping to have a policy across the northeast, but that hasn't been able to be done. Members are really asked what they wish us to do in relation to this, bearing in mind the current position the trade are in and the effect it would have upon the trade if we put those requirements into place.
Is that it, Tasman?
Have any specific points for me? I think the report it's got quite a lot of information in it.
Phil?
Thanks, Chair. I think the other thing to note with this report is possibly some of the origins for this, and it's, I don't know, possibly of interest to Councillor Roughead, is part of the origin around this was very much around the issue with Newcastle Gateshead and their air quality in that corridor from sort of the Tyne Bridge Gateshead through the central motorway, and that was driving a lot of the desire in Tyne and Wear, or in Gateshead and Newcastle. I think we've always had probably some aspect of provision in our policy where we try to either limit age of vehicles or look to Euro standards to actually try and ensure that vehicles that are coming online have better emissions. So it's a continuing improving sort of fleet, I suppose. So we have been in a better position, but the origins for this were very much driven by Newcastle Gateshead. There is a view that this may be too complex. And again, one of the questions that was asked about this and we discussed recently was whether or not it could be simplified, and you actually looked at the vehicle tax regime to to influence or set your license fees as well, rather than whether it was on an actual emission standard or otherwise. But very much for information. But as Tasman says, really just direction of where the committee want to go with this, but we can bring it back for review.
Thank you. Councillor Bowman.
Thank you, Chair. I did have a conversation with a taxi driver yesterday who owns a business, is registered in North Tyneside. His stance about eco-ness, green policies is it's quite shocking, actually. I don't care. And so I've got an issue with this because I think it's right that we bring in a green policy, that we actually drive it forward, and we shouldn't just be relying on North Tyneside and Newcastle and Gateshead and South Tyneside and so on. We should be driving our own policy, and you know, we should be like the leading light, as it were. So I would look to see taxis in the near future move over to electric. I was quite shocked with this conversation yesterday. I didn't realise that that certain people just digging in their heels really strongly, because it's going to cost them dearly to change their vehicles and so on. But we need to be mindful of climate change. We need to be, we're trying to be a green county, aren't we? We're trying to be the leading light in United Kingdom, actually. And this is all part and parcel of a bigger picture. So yes, anything that brings in eco-ness and green policies, I would definitely recommend it. And thank you very much for the report.
Thank you. Ironically enough, the portfolio holder mentioned the other day, with emissions on vehicles, why not, as you can test vehicles' emissions, and consequently the tax is payable different to different vehicles depending on their emissions, and possibly have a scaled system for that. So, you know, if you're paying so much tax because of your emission, then it's then reduced with lower priced tax cars. So yeah, it would force people eventually to go electric where they can, where they could. Councillor Seymour, I've got you next on the list, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is part of the same thing, really, with Northumberland declaring a climate change emergency, and its plan about a year and a half ago, I think, was that, you know, with green economy efficiencies and to reach zero emissions by 2030, we really need to push on this. So I'm just wondering at the moment how many electric vehicles? Do we know how many electric vehicles do we have? I know we're putting in electric chargers throughout our towns, throughout Northumberland. And so, you know, it makes it easier. I appreciate, you know, taxi drivers are on the clock, and so maybe they wouldn't want to do it, but perhaps, you know, I mean, it's something that we have to do for the environment. So do you know exactly how many electric vehicles we have for taxis?
I don't know who wants that one.
Phil, do you want me to answer that one?
More than happy for you to answer that question. More than happy.
I couldn't give you a number straight away. However, we can circulate that information to committee members. We can run some reports. What I would say is there are certain areas within the county that have significantly more than other areas, just for the way in which they would work. Sometimes the distances from the charging points would be too far for some areas. We also have a larger proportion of hybrid vehicles than just electric, which seems to work for some companies rather than a full electric vehicle. But I can certainly circulate that information for you.
Phil?
I think just to add to what Tasman said is, obviously, I think electric vehicles are still expensive. The technology is still emerging. And one of the things which I think has been a barrier, and because again, we've got, you know, good pockets of best practice amongst the trade already. But as Tasman says, there are certain limitations on the infrastructure. But I think also when you look at the charging arrangements for vehicles, for some operators, if they're getting limited mileage, they've then got significant downtime on when they're not actually using the vehicle itself. So they're not making money in that regard. So I think with all these things, there's a balance to be struck somewhere. And I think it's probably like all things, there would be places where it's very useful and others where it's not as practicable. And I suppose we've seen that across our own fleet for Northumberland County Council. We will use electric vehicles in some locations, in the more southeast locations, but it's more challenging in others. But as Tasman says, we can bring some information back.
Thank you. Councillor Roughead?
I think Councillor Sesswood was before me.
I'm just going down the list as I see them here. Councillor Sesswood, would you like to go first then?
Yes, I don't mind. Thank you very much, Councillor Roughead. I didn't know you was first, but there you go. It's frustrating when people have the I don't care attitude, but, you know, we regulate the system, so at the end of the day, they would have to follow the system that they work in, and if it's been regulated for, then they can have as many I don't cares as they want, and it wouldn't happen. They would just have to follow the rules. As regards your comment about bringing in possible cheaper car tax and things for the emissions, well, I mean, that was the case until just 2, 3, I'm not sure, maybe 3 years ago, where low emissions could have something like a £30 tax. My old car had a £30 tax, and even though I bought one that's newer and more efficient and less emissions, I pay the full tax now. When one assumes that is because they're encouraging you to buy EVs, and they are tax-free, as far as if my information is correct. So I think that covers their point. But yeah, I mean, I don't really want to be somebody who has to regulate every last thing, but I do believe in this particular situation, we need to have the paper come forward. We need to discuss it, and you know, we need to do what we best. And you know, Councillor Bowman had a fair point. You know, this council is very high up on the agenda with the climate change, and one of these things are the conversion of a lot of council vehicles into EVs and things like that. So you know, if the operators are given a choice, then it's up to them to pick if they want to pay less taxes or prepare for the future. Now I understand, of course, the outlay and the uncertainty with COVID is a little bit more difficult now. So, you know, we don't have to sort of say, right, then you've got a cut-off time of this particular day. There's nothing to say that we can't feed the changes in on a gradual basis. which indeed I believe one of the last meetings we had when we were still meeting was to do exactly like that. We looked at something, fees I think it was, if memory serves me right, over all the different areas, and we decided that we can't just change them unilaterally at the flick of a switch. We would have to bring them in over a period of time. So I think that's probably what has to happen here. But we have to go in one direction, and to do that we need to discuss it. So bring the paper back, please.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Ruffhead, we'll go to you now.
Thanks, Chair. I would say that I agree with the sentiments of everybody here that climate change is high on all of our agendas in terms of we don't seem to be able to be in a meeting these days without it being mentioned. However, I do think that from reading the report, it is worthy that this come back, because I think it is a bit evident reading the report that there needs to be further engagement with the trade on the specifics of this issue, because COVID kind of interfered with the way, and obviously the new way of work and online, that should be much easier for the team to do that. But I would just reiterate from what I was saying earlier on, although it's aspirational to do this and it's morally the right thing for the planet to do this, I'd say it should be a phased approach, so there's no sudden extra burden on people, especially in COVID, and perhaps looking at a more extended leniency over the next couple of years to make it more gradual so it has less of an impact. And although it's not maybe the remit of this committee, again, just if this is something that is going to be mandated through the course of time, that perhaps some form of grant or funding or what have you, whether extra vehicles in the council's fleet could be purchased and people could like pay as you go type basis for them, just some form of an innovation on how the council can obviously keep people in the taxi trade and that it impacts them as least as possible within the transition of that. So I just think it's worthy of coming back to a future meeting.
Thank you for that. Well, to sum up on those things, I guess Phil and Tasman, you accepted that everyone would like to see that come back for one thing. And regarding the future reports for fees, tariffs, zones, number of Hackney carriages and CCTV reports back on those, please. And hopefully, having said that, I presume we'll get them back for the 29th of April.
I think what I would wish to do outside of the meeting, Chair, with yourself and Councillor Parry, is if we sit down, have a conversation, and we agree how to prioritise them and bring them back to you. But I do think with something like the emissions, that does form part of our overall policy, and it's probably right to start looking at that in chunks, so we can do that as the first part of that. So yes, we will agree a timetable with yourself, committee services, and I suppose fundamentally this is getting to where I want to be, which is having a forward plan for the committee, so we're not looking for business, the committee is generating its business, and we're then as officers servicing your committee correctly. So yes, we can agree the formatting of that to take forward. Councillor Hutchinson.
Thank you. I see Councillor Seston's got his hand up.
Yes, Chair. I was just actually had a thought. It doesn't happen very often, but it did today, about something that Phil said before, which was taxis, and by the nature of the miles they travel and the time that they're in and out all the time, they don't have time to charge up in between the electric vehicles. It reminded me of a programme I was watching not too long ago, where people were asking for an electric vehicle local only lane on a motorway, and the actual cars, when they drive over it, they pick up the charge from the electric points within the ground. And so they were kept being charged all the time, recharged all the time. Now, I mean, technology changes all the time. So if that were to come in, in taxi ranks, you could have underground electric charging, and then they would be charged every time they sat in the taxi rank. Anyway, that was just something from a programme I've seen not so long since. It's technology, and what may seem pie in the sky 1 second, tends to be a matter of fact a couple of years later.
Yes, all right. I'm pleased you weren't asleep. Right, having said that, there's no any other urgent business. So what we're going to do now is everybody leaves this meeting. I know it seems silly, but everybody leaves this meeting, go back into your calendars, and then we'll rejoin the licensing meeting from there. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you in hopefully a couple of minutes. Cheers. Bye.